All right, so welcome to 7.5 Theories of Development. We're going to look at three of them. The first one is Rostow, W. Rostow in the 1920s. Then we're going to look at Wallerstein's World Systems Theory, and then we're going to look at commodity dependency. We're going to look at those three. Okay, so first one, Rostow's model of economic development. You think of this one like an airplane. Basically, he's looking at the fact you're going to cut off international trade. And so you're going to go along the ground slowly, and then boom, take off. You're going to do everything you can in the country. So at first, you're in stage one, which I'll get to the stages here. Stage one is you're going to be focusing on the primary sector. That's where you are before. You don't have a ton of growth going on, very limited mobility, and it's very traditional based society. But then something has to click. You need a spark. And spark is going to happen in stage two when the leadership usually has to come and say, no, we're going to do things differently. And they're going to start putting more money into usually one sector of the economy, and you're going to move to more commercial agriculture as your starting spot, and then hopefully the technology diffuses from there, and then boom, you're going to take off. How are you going to take off? It's like an airplane. Now you're going to fuse out. This is the Industrial Revolution in the U.S. or a little bit later. This is Japan in the 1880s. You are starting to see you become more urbanized, and you're going to start to see way more growth happen over time. Again, it's all internal though. There's no real trade. You can be focusing on international trade, but that's not the focus. The focus is on your internal mechanism. Fourth is a drive maturity when essentially your stuff in stage three is going to spread out throughout the economy. And then stage five is you are now going to be in the tertiary sector and things are going to be more service oriented. So if you think about it this way, stage one, your focus is the primary sector. Stage three, your focus is the secondary sector. And stage five, your focus is the service sector. And then stages 2 and 4 are the transitions between those different sectors. What you're looking at here is this model provides basically a model for internal development. So it worked for a lot of places that would be on the more high end right now. This model, as you can see here, it was basically what most industrialized countries, like the most developed countries in the world today, are. So primarily like United States, Western Europe, and Japan. However, what this doesn't look at is it doesn't look at the role of international trade. It doesn't suggest you could do differently. And then the other one that I like to kind of bring up is, okay, the United States hit this high era of mass consumption in about 1925, and then again right after World War II. Aren't we more developed now than we were in 1925 or 1945, depending on, or 1950, let's say, depending on which way you look at it? So either way, there are definitely some weaknesses here, but it can give you a model that is focused purely on your country. One of the countries that also tried this more recently is India. Tried this in the 1970s and 1980s when they essentially put high tariffs on almost everything to leave the country. And so foreign businesses were basically kept out, and the Indian economy was basically starting to grow based solely on the back of Indian companies. Okay. Now, the second one is Wallerstein's World Systems Theory. Basically, this one is a look at the world is going to be always be dependent on each other. There is no perfect way to look at this model. Wallerstein basically takes the model and says, okay, there's always going to be a core. Those are going to be your more service-oriented countries. Those are going to be your most developed countries. Then you're going to have the semi-periphery. They're going to be the places that puts things together. Secondary sector is going to be dominant. And then you're always going to have the periphery, which is at the low end of things. Now, you can move between them. It's like Rostow, you can't move backwards in theory. Here, you can move back and forth. So like, for instance, the Soviet Union, before the fall of the Cold War, would have been one of the core countries, where now here it's considered a semi-periphery country. You could argue small countries within here. I have no issue with that. But that's the theory as a whole, that you're going to have some countries are always going to be dependent on others. This is basically an example of neocolonialism, where you think colonialism, like the political and economic control of areas by the more dominant countries in the world in the 1900s, especially 17, 18, 1900s, and back to the 1600s. Well, neocolonialism based effect, no, it's economics. Is that the most developed countries in the world still exploit and use the lesser developed countries of the world, but now it's just only economics. So to put this into a scale form, here's some of the things to look at here. You should know some of these characteristics. You should pause it and read some of those here. But this also basically completely looks at international trade, right? So the U.S. is going to get stuff from China and Brazil and Mexico and India. It's going to get stuff from Zimbabwe and other countries in the periphery where stuff is mined. Now, some criticisms of this model. What happens when we go to post-industrial? It doesn't answer how do countries change, or Rostow looks at how countries can change. Wallerstein just says, hey, everyone's going to be dependent on each other. One of the best things about this model as a whole is that it does work on multiple scales. Like here's Brazil. So this is GDP per capita of the national average. You can see here, Brasilia, Sao Paulo, really high. Then you have your semi-periphery here, and then out on the outskirts would be your periphery. How about Mexico? Mexico City, tourism, industrialization to ship stuff back in the United States. How about China? Same thing. Urban, rural, one of the biggest countries in terms of rural divide. Urban China is as developed as anywhere in the world. Rural China is as undeveloped as anywhere in the world. And so what you're looking at here is that this model of Wallerstein's world systems theory, also called the core periphery model, works at multiple scales. It doesn't tell you how to develop, but it does give you a pretty good indicator of just where developmental levels are. Our last one is commodity dependency. It's when your economy is dependent on a single industry or more for 60% of your economy. So think oil is one of the big ones here. Think tourism is one of the big ones here. So think about if your economy is completely based on tourism and a hurricane hits, then what? Think if your economy is completely based on oil prices and oil prices tank, then what? So either way, what you have here is when you're commodity dependent, you're going to be transnational corporations are going to be hugely influential. Now, so think about any of the resorts in the Caribbean, or think major oil companies. When they come in there, they're going to bring a lot of positives. They're going to bring a ton of jobs. They're going to bring a ton of money for infrastructure. They're going to give, just the multiplier effect on those jobs is massive. But then you're completely dependent on them. So there's pros and cons of being that influence transnational corporations. Yeah, they're bringing jobs, but they're not being great jobs. If the market's doing really well, that's awesome. But if the market's doing crappy, what happens there? And so what you have here is that, yes, you are going to be dependent on a foreign market. That can be really good for you, but that can also mean that the foreign market has some control over you. This is something that China is doing really well, is that China is going into places where resources are abundant and trying to take advantage and trying to build infrastructure by giving them foreign direct investment and trying to provide more and more ways for China to gain influence. That pro or con, depending on how you look at it. This is look here at places that would be considered commodity dependent. So green is dependent on agriculture exports, blue is on energy exports, and red is on the export of minerals. It's a lot of countries. But if you think about it, if you go back to, you compare this one to core countries of the world, core and the kind of places that are not commodity dependent have a lot of similarities. All right, so here's what you should know from this commodity dependency, pros and cons of it. You should know Wallerstein's world systems theory and everything that goes into it in terms of what does it work, how does it work, what does it work, you should be able to define it, things like that. And then last one, Rostow, same thing. In all those cases, whether it's Rostow or Wallerstein, you should know the basics of the stages and you should know the basics of the characteristics of the countries.